Welcome everybody, welcome Ashish. Also, we just stumbled in. We're at the moment with 16 people, but I really trust there will be a lot more people because we have 55 registrants and it's running up, 17, 18, so it's going up the right way. Welcome to the third episode of the COVID Café, a co-production of Oxford Novib and KUNO. Today we focus on how the global crisis, COVID crisis, interferes with geopolitics. And I think we have two very well informed and well experienced speakers. And we have all you, it's running up, 18, 19. I see we have almost 20 attendees, most welcome, and I'm sure there will be more. Maybe you can participate with this cafe because it is a COVID cafe. And we really want you to join our debates. So share where you're from, what your name is, and perhaps what organization you work for. And feel free to post your questions and support me in finding the right questions for our both speakers. We have two speakers this afternoon, Peter Veit and Ashish Pradhan. I will introduce them both to you. Peter Veit is a very experienced diplomat who served the Dutch government, the EU and the NATO in numerous complex situations, many of them complex conflict settings. To name just one, from 2008 to 2011, he was special representative of the European Union and led the team of the EU in Kosovo. And maybe you remember, at the time, Kosovo was just declared, the Albanians in Kosovo just declared themselves independent from Serbia, to mention a conflict setting. Before that, he was, for instance, head of the mission in Aceh, also just about after a peace agreement between Indonesia and Aceh. He has extensive experiences in the Middle East and in the Balkans. I think he has a deep understanding of geopolitics, and I'm very glad you're with us, Peter. You live partly in the Netherlands, partly in Sweden. You have a Swedish wife, and I think your mother is from Sweden. We here in the Netherlands, and I think in many other countries, live in some kind of a lockdown. But there's just one country in Europe that doesn't do about any lockdown. And they just go to restaurants, and the children go to school, and that's Sweden. How do those Swedish people look at us in the Netherlands, living in lockdown, don't go to restaurants? Are they feeling sorry for us?
Well, I think, Peter, it's perhaps too early to say if a lockdown-free approach like in Sweden has been very effective. So perhaps we have to wait a little bit more before we can evaluate properly. But let me say this, what struck me, because I'm living in the south of Sweden, facing Denmark. And that's an interesting area because the two neighbors are busy developing a hub for growth and deeper integration, using the bridge over the Sound as a link between Copenhagen and Malmö. So far, so good, and a lot of progress has been made, but all of a sudden, COVID struck and borders were closed without any consultation nor any prior notification. That made me think, if two highly developed countries, both members of the European Union, fail to communicate properly before taking ad hoc measures or emergency steps, how difficult will it not be for the international community to communicate with the people in need in conflict-affected areas, with the leaders of armed groups, with community leaders. I think that COVID has a serious effect in a negative sense on all efforts pertaining to prevention, to confidence building, track 2 diplomacy and mediation. I would like to expand on that a bit later, but I think that communication is so key to our efforts, and we are all in this together. Our efforts to build peace across the world, that we have to make sure we get it right, and that if once the restrictions are lifted, hopefully not too late, that we can resume attending to this important activity.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. I'm sure we'll elaborate a lot on all these issues you address right now. The other speaker I would like to introduce is Ashish Pradhan. Ashish Pradhan is Senior Analyst, UN Advocacy and Research at the International Crisis Group in New York. He is following the day-to-day developments in and around the UN Security Council, and his other work is primarily focusing on crises in Africa and Asia, and he connects both sides. You work in New York, and New York has been hit very, very, very hard by the COVID crisis. Here in Europe, we're slowly trying to get things a little bit back to normal. How is day-to-day life in New York at the moment?
Well, first of all, Peter, thank you so much for this for the opportunity, and it's good to be on this call. And you know, as Peter, you were saying about Europe and you know the developed world and developed countries, I couldn't help but think the state of the developed country that I'm in. I'm originally from Nepal, but I've been in the U.S. for a number of years now, and it's been striking to see you know, the response to the pandemic, and I think it's in a way been a great equalizer in terms of you know, seeing how difficult it's been for even such an advanced economy and a fairly advanced health system here to handle this. And New York has obviously been the hardest hit, and things are less intense than they were a few weeks ago, but you know, people are still trying to adjust to this new reality. It looks like we'll be staying put for a little while longer. The UN has announced already that it's going to be, you know, not going back to work as normal until at least the end of June, maybe even longer. So until then, it's been a lot of VTC calls, webinars, phone calls, and telework, which is, I guess, the new reality for most of us.
Okay, thank you so much for this opening on day-to-day life also. Let's dive into the geopolitics now. When I was discussing this with Su Ying from Oxford Nova, the topic geopolitics, she came with the topic because she remembered Guterres in March did make a big plea to the whole global society community, and he asked for a global COVID ceasefire. He called us to focus on the true fight of our lives, and somehow I have the feeling it was well noted, but not really acted upon. Peter, how did you perceive this call, and the reactions upon this call of Guterres?
Well, I would like to look at it under two headings. I think top down, I see this as a further erosion of the United Nations legal and moral authority. And I must be quite frank with you, Peter. I think that it's becoming more and more clear that certain permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are failing to live up to the standards, the principles, and the ideals of the Charter. So I think I could imagine that the efforts at maintaining the peace and at peace building will devolve perhaps gradually towards regional organizations. The other aspect is bottom up. Bottom up, I believe that because of the failure of the Security Council to endorse the Secretary General's appeal, efforts at prevention and peace building will be weakened. And they will be weakened also as a result of the impact of the pandemic on two counts. I would like to put it this way. Social distancing and peace building are not really compatible. It is, what I mean to say, it is very difficult to reach out to people in need if you can't have face-to-face contact with them. It is very difficult to convince them to lay down their arms, to work towards a compromise or towards reconciliation in the end, if you can't be physically present with them and listen to their needs and their grievances. So with the current restrictions on travel and on physical presence in the field, this will become a serious handicap. The other one will be that generous nations who are traditionally funding peace-building efforts and prevention efforts will become temporarily, I hope, more inward-looking because of the priorities internally and attending to their own economies. And therefore, less resources will likely become available for this important action of the United Nations and of the world community.
Thank you, Peter. I tried to open up the chat for everybody, but I'm not sure whether the other attendees can see what's happening in the chat. But be aware, if you can't see each other, we can see you all. So please share your questions with us. And Johanna, my colleague, is checking all those questions, and we will bring them into the debate here in the cafe. Ashish, already some beautiful observations from Peter Veit, but how was the call of Guterres received in the Security Council and all people moving around the Security Council in New York?
Well, and I think Peter's already touched on a number of the main issues and challenges that we've seen since the call was issued over 2 months ago. And for us at Crisis Group, I think we had a little bit of skepticism at the start when the call was issued, thinking maybe this is another one of the many sort of symbolic things that we see from diplomats that doesn't get much resonance. But the surprising thing was, pleasantly surprising thing was, in the immediate aftermath, there was, a decent amount of receptiveness on the ground in a few places around the world. Whether it was the Philippines with, some armed groups there, or separatists in Cameroon, or the ELN group in Colombia, or indeed, in Yemen with the Saudi-led coalition. There were some, appeals made that reflected and echoed the Secretary General's call, to lay down arms, to pause fighting given this pandemic. Now, unfortunately, the big part that was missing, as we've already touched on, is there was no political endorsement from the Security Council. And the frustrating thing for me personally was, I spoke to council members for the course of the last 2 months about this issue. And when you speak to them one-on-one, they all say, yes, we support this call. We know the council needs to endorse this, but, and there was always a but, and, especially got mired in narrow national interests, especially when you look at the standoff that occurred between the US and China, that really in the end ended up hampering the council's ability to come together and as a united body say, look, not only do we endorse this call, but we also support the efforts of the WHO and other parts of the UN system that are working to address this pandemic. And I think that latter point, the WHO point, ended up being the sort of red line for Washington, and really ended up hamstringing the overall response. And what we saw since then was the momentum was lost. I mentioned, a few groups had taken up the call, the ceasefire call at the outset, but after, partly because I think, a lack of political endorsement from the council, those efforts then started to dissipate. The other party in whether it's Yemen, whether it's Colombia, didn't reciprocate, and now we're left with a sort of back to square one. The resolution that the council was negotiating is on ice, and there is no sort of Security Council product that has expressed a unified view on COVID-19. 2 months in, which is really unfortunate.
Thank you. I'll just hop on to Johanna because I see the first questions coming in. I'll introduce Johanna also. Johanna is my colleague, and she's supporting me to check the chat box and so on. I see some interesting questions coming along. Can you pick one out for me, Johanna?
Yes, so we have one question on how do you see the effectivity of the COVID-19 awareness for risk awareness and mitigation, plus the people willing to opt for advice in the context, I guess in conflict context, because they're talking about Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, where already protracted crises make lives vulnerable. So yeah, how can you create awareness for COVID-19, and how do you effectively do that?
Okay, we would like to react first. Peter or Ashish, who can I give the floor?
Well, just one comment. It's going to become more challenging, and we are not only talking about maintaining the momentum in ongoing peace processes, like the ones that were mentioned, because of restrictions that are prevailing at this moment, and in the longer term, a lack of resources. It's also about early action and prevention. In other words, in how far are we still able to take initiatives in new emerging conflict areas that have not yet reached the radar screen, but where prevention would be extremely useful and important.
Could you give an example of this new crisis we're talking about?
Sorry?
Could you give an example of these news crises that are just under the radar now, but are popping up slowly?
Well, we are collectively through the United Nations and with the help of regional organizations, building up a mechanism for early warning and early action. That means that we are working on the basis of indicators, for instance, through monitoring social media to see if there is an upsurge in hate messaging, or if people are collectively forced to migrate from their homesteads. Those are indicators of an impending, a potential impending crisis. And they happen in Africa, in the Sahel region, and maybe also to a lesser degree in the Middle East and in Asia. So without going into specific examples, I see that the outlook for the short and medium term is not very good at this moment.
Thank you. Ashish, you already touched upon the relation between China and the United States of America, also in relation to the WHO and within the Security Council. Trump is making loud accusations towards China. And I think maybe he's motivated because of internal affairs in the United States. But do you think there is a risk that it will really hamper international relations when Trump is making these accusations?
I think we're already starting to see that, as an example, at the UN, I think there's a sort of a more concerted push by the US to try to single out China where possible, not just on, directly COVID-19 related issues, but also now related to something like Hong Kong. So just in the past couple of days, the US has been ramping up the pressure at the Security Council to hold a discussion on the situation in Hong Kong. And in fact, they'll be meeting behind closed doors later today. Despite the protestations of the Chinese diplomats. The unfortunate thing is, again, I was hoping at the start of this process that maybe, at the very least, even if the Security Council was a little bit late in endorsing the Secretary General's call, if they could have come together on a resolution, I think one benefit would have been that it would have been the first instance where both Washington and Beijing signed on to the same piece of paper that spoke about the pandemic. Unfortunately, now we're seeing it go the opposite direction, where it seems like that is the last thing that both governments are interested in. There is some level of thinking and attention, and in their statements they say that they still support the ceasefire call. China goes out of its way to say that it still does support the WHO, but in practicality, because of the difference, it's really keeping a wider range of support going to these bodies, and it has an impact. When you see that the US not taking part in a big conference that the EU and others put together on vaccines, that's not it doesn't inspire too much confidence, and in fact gives you some worries about the period ahead. And just to maybe go back on the question that was asked earlier about the various risk mitigation in the various sort of conflict situations around the world. Peter, again, you've touched on this already, including your earlier remarks about peace building. But I think there is a really big tension between the types of measures that will need to be imposed and enforced to try to mitigate the public health consequences of COVID-19 versus the socioeconomic impacts. And so when you have economies and places where people are dependent on day-to-day labor and moving around, and they can't, we fortunately are very lucky to have the luxury of being able to work remotely, work from home, and not a lot of people have that, particularly in some of these countries mentioned. So if you start to see that the government feels pressure to really enforce lockdown measures, that could mean that security forces that are deployed, that could create already a tense environment where people that are already feeling repressed by those same security forces don't feel as keen to obey restriction orders. They also need to go and try to make a living for themselves. So does that create a sense of social instability, some social unrest? I think we're already starting to see that in some parts of the globe. And again, I really echo what Peter said earlier about I think there's real practical challenges to those of us on the other side, trying to mitigate the consequences of conflict and of this disease. When we can't be out there, doing the face-to-face, in-person mediation, things of that nature. That is a major impediment. You can do a lot of things over VTC, thankfully, but it's hard to do a proper shuttle diplomacy, for example, over Zoom. So that's another thing that we have to keep in mind with various conflict situations.
Thank you. We see indeed a lot of health consequences because of COVID. We see a lot of socio-economic consequences because of COVID. We see some unrest also indeed, and some people taking political advantage of the situation geopolitically. And you connect it to a lack of leadership, I think, globally. Peter, what should be do we really need this global leadership on COVID? Because it's also completely fair to say we really need to take care for our own sorrows and first check our own health systems and make our social economic consequences as minimal as possible. What could be the added value of a global leadership in this COVID crisis?
What would be the added value of a global
leadership? What are we missing?
Well, I think that is the heart of the problem in which we find ourselves at this moment. That not only is there now leadership on the side of the superpowers, the permanent members of the Security Council, but equally we see a number of leaders who are acting unwisely, who are discarding scientific advice, public health advice, and who have not understood at this stage that working together and multilateral approaches are the best solutions to where we find ourselves. Let me, in this context, also say a word about the leadership role that the European Union should play, because we see, as Ashish has pointed out, a harsher rhetoric in the relationship between the United States and China. We see China becoming more and more assertive, also in its relation with Europe. But Europe should not remain a passive bystander in this current struggle for influence, but should show leadership and become more active, in particular in Africa, to provide aid and assistance to the people in need, both in the sectors of public health and where necessary, food help to avoid hunger disasters breaking out in parts of the African continent, and finally to mitigate the social economic impact of the deepening recession as we see it. So that is important. The Netherlands government has been advised to allocate 1 billion euros specifically for added aid and assistance to Africa. We know that the European Union is very much involved in internal soul searching about how to overcome the recession, but it should not stop the Union from playing a leadership role on the international and on the global scene.
Assis, thank you. Do you think this European leadership will be accepted in the Security Council? Because it is like the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, each have their own chair. Are they willing to work together and take up this global leadership?
So far, that's exactly what I was going to point at is, there has been obviously a severe gap in leadership from several quarters. I saw a statistic, I think just a couple of days ago, about the countries with the four highest number of COVID cases. It might have been cases or deaths, and it was the United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil, and Russia. And people were pointing to what that says about the nature of the leadership in those countries. And I think we can have a separate conversation about populism and in the midst of a pandemic as well. But I think European leadership and activism has been appreciated. And what I mentioned about the US and China, what I didn't go into was, for the last 2 months, even though they haven't been able to agree, there has been one entity trying to mediate between those, and that's been France. And at the highest levels, I think the French government has been trying to get Washington and Beijing aligned. It hasn't paid dividends so far, and it probably won't. But at least it was encouraging to see someone keeping in mind that there needs to be a sort of collective response. And I think this pandemic has the nature of it just poses these really bizarre circumstances on countries and governments, where the first instinct is to close your borders. You need to sort of isolate yourself. You need to stop flights coming in. You need to stop people coming in from outside, which doesn't lend itself to collective thinking as much, right? And I was, but looking back at at other big outbreaks, Ebola, for example, I was actually in West Africa in 2014 at the height of the outbreak in Liberia. And at the time, the U.S. really led the fight to have a collective response to this. It wasn't allowed to get to this nearly to this level that we see with COVID-19 now. And I think that speaks to the importance of institutions as well, right? It's not just about the willingness, but it's also about the support that you can give to the institutions, the multilateral institutions that do exist. And we talked about the Security Council, which obviously has a certain level of ability to deal with something like this, but there are other agencies like the WHO and then elsewhere which have the proper mandate. And I think just to finish on your question, Peter, on the the European leadership at the Security Council, I think it's been sorely needed, and it's provided a fail-safe. Whether we look at things like looking outside COVID-19 on Iran and JCPOA and the nuclear deal, the Europeans have been the ones to sort of hold things together as much as possible, despite what what the U.S. government is trying to do. And it might not so much be about whether that's accepted at the Security Council. It might be more that can they try to do more? Because I think if they try to do that, there will be the space for it. And a final word on that, I think Crisis Group, as several others, have been looking at ever since 2017, pretty much, since the Trump administration came into play and really started to emphasize this America First strategy. We were looking at, well, if it's America First, and if they start to take steps back from their international commitments, who can fill that void? And I think one obvious answer people looked at was China. China has a lot of growing ties with various parts of the world, whether it's Europe, like Peter talked about, whether it's Africa through the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's other parts of Asia and elsewhere. And I guess you can say that to some extent they've tried to leverage that in the aftermath of COVID-19, through so-called mask diplomacy. There's also been, I think they haven't capitalized on it as much, whether it was because of the gaps in some of the assistance that they sent and the quality of the assistance that they sent, or whether it's not being able to capitalize politically by showing more leadership on the international stage more broadly. I think that also leaves some room for improvement.
Thank you, I see some questions dropping in, so I switch over to Joanna. Could you pick one, or there's a new panelist, the new speaker, please, or new attendee?
Yes, I think the first two questions are actually already answered, because they were on the role of the EU and how European countries should seek to position themselves against China and the US. And I guess that's what we already talked about, but there's a new question, and that's on what do the speakers believe that civil society and NGOs should be doing, or should be doing more to advance a rule-based multilateralism and a rights-based COVID response? So the role of the civil society and NGOs.
Who would like to reflect first? Peter, can I give you the floor?
I'm at risk of sounding too negative or too pessimistic. Maybe it's because of age, but we are unfortunately in a situation now as a result of the pandemic, and because public health is a matter for the state, that there is a tendency for the state globally, everywhere, to assume greater importance. The state is now seen increasingly by people, if I'm not wrong, as the main source of rescue and survival, perhaps, amidst a unpredictable and potentially fatal disaster that spreads all over the world. So the people are looking towards the state for guidance, for support, and for survival. The risk is that this will encourage malignant leaders to abuse the powers of the state, and that we see more and more tendencies towards authority in the state growing. There's even a tendency towards surveillance states, in the sense that because of the necessity to control possible the spreading of the virus and those who have been affected by it, that surveillance will also be used in a malicious manner to control the activities of individual citizens. Coming to the role of civil society, I would say that it is becoming more and more difficult for civil society to speak up for important principles like respect for the rule of law, for democracy, and against violations of individual and collective human rights. So, of course, in my view, civil society should be assisted wherever it can, but I think that the odds at the moment are against freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And that makes it all the more difficult for civil society and individual community leaders to step forward and to express themselves. They will need support wherever they can. It is up to us now to give them the support and encouragement that they need. Particularly in these challenging circumstances that I expect to continue for the short and medium term.
Thank you, Peter. Ashish, you are civil society, I could say, and freedom of speech, human rights. I think it's all in the core of the International Crisis Group. You are advocacy. You are doing advocacy in the heart of the UN system, the Security Council. How do you think you can be more active, more and more effective? And do you feel you are winning ground, or are you losing ground at the moment when you try to influence political leaders?
These are really important questions, and questions that we've been grappling with as well as an organization. And I think the first thing I'll say is sort of echoing what Peter already mentioned in his remarks. I think obviously the state being at the heart of the response remains the case. But what I would say is, in this new reality, given the lack of mobility, given the lack of sort of access, we're starting to, and then, in addition, the sort of more authoritarian tendencies of some governments. And we're seeing limitations on what, a key part of our society is doing, especially journalists, their access, their ability to work, to report, and the resonance and reception that they get, especially in light of so much disinformation going around the pandemic, I think is a major challenge for all of us. Now, I think what that means is that it adds, I think, a little bit of extra responsibility for those of us on the civil society side to continue raising the alarm bells. We've already talked about early warning, for example, and that's really at the heart of what an organization like Crisis Group does. And obviously, it's impacted our work as well. Our hallmark is our work is based on the field. We have people posted in 40 odd different countries around the world, but at the moment, they're not able to go out and about and talk to their contacts and get that first-hand information as easily as they used to before. But I think in a weird way, because it's again, this pandemic is the great equalizer, and everyone is in that same position. Thankfully, so far, we haven't felt the sort of practical impacts as much. And certainly, speaking for myself here in New York, I think I've been talking to our diplomatic contacts here more frequently than I did in the pre-COVID era, and because it's it's a little bit easier to just get people over the phone than to arrange a coffee discussion. I think that matters partly because there is a again, sort of operational challenge to all of us that are trying to sort of settle into this new reality. For some occupations, it's a little bit harder. For us, it hasn't been too hard. But I think the other, this is where I'll bring in the New York experience. The other thing to keep in mind is maybe it's not so much about what central governments and federal governments can do. Maybe we should also be looking at cities and sort of provinces and different levels of response there. Because in the United States, I think some of the more reassuring measures taken against the pandemic have come from state level or city level officials. Certainly in New York, I think the governor of New York State has garnered quite a lot of appreciation for the way that he's handled the crisis in New York, especially compared to the U.S. president's own handling of the crisis. And I think that that gives us lessons about how to leverage and use different parts of a governance system. That if one part isn't responding well, maybe there are other parts at different levels that can address it. And obviously, this isn't the case in all parts of the globe, including my own country, where there are federal provinces, but the central government really is at the forefront and at the behest and has most of the resources. So the federal governments, the provincial governments don't really have that same sort of authority. But where possible, we might see more of an emphasis on cities, for example. And I know that's a line of work that a lot of people are looking into, is whether it's climate change, whether it's this pandemic response, is the importance of cities. So I think that's something that might become more pronounced in the future.
Thank you, Aziz. We're almost 40 minutes on our in the cafe. I think we slowly will go to a finish. I think there's more room for one or two more questions. Johanna, I see people are still interested in this role the European Union could play. Could you elaborate on this question about it?
Yeah, so this is again on the role of the European Union. And exactly, it's on how much of a diplomatic influence can the EU or does the EU have, and what can it use to play on major players like other countries, so the United States or Russia, but also on coalitions like the G10, G20, NATO, who again have a big impact on humanitarian operations all over the world.
So what are we missing if we don't take this leadership? Peter Veit, would you like to do it first?
It has been noted in a recent advice that this pandemic is the first global crisis without United States leadership. And this means that the European Union has an opportunity, and I'm not pessimistic that the European Union can pull together and become more effective, more united, better, more capable, better resourced than before. I am I'm not 100% sure, but I think the chances are there that the European Union can come out of this episode much better than it used to be. The thing we are grappling with is solidarity versus own interest. But it seems to me that there need not be any contradiction between solidarity and own interest. And therefore, I think it is important that the recent proposals of the European Commission to spend massively on recovery of the economies affected by the pandemic gets political support in all member states. We have struggled with the departure of our British friends, Brexit. Now we need to make sure that we can overcome the recession in the shortest possible time frame. It will be a huge challenge, and I hope it will not go at the expense of a more global outlook of the European Union. But I hope that in the months to come, you will see that Europe can stand up to the challenges it is facing. And these challenges, as they have been named the geopolitical second wave, come, as we discussed, from China, from Russia, and from the policies of the United States president, who is actually busy tearing down the multilateral edifice wherever he can. So it's not only the Security Council of the United Nations, but it's also the World Health Organization, and it's the World Trade Organization who have been in the focus of President Trump's attention. So all in all, Europe collectively has the resources to get it right. Russia remains unpredictable, but is economically weakened. China is more assertive, not only in terms of power play and land grab, but also by investing in weakened economies, thereby creating a debt trap, as we see in many parts of countries in Africa and Asia, but also in southern states of the southern member states of the European Union. I think there's a greater awareness now that this is a mean world full of challenges, and that Europe has to become mature in geopolitical actions and not concentrate only on its internal situation at this moment.
And I certainly think, just to chime in from the perspective across the Atlantic, I certainly sympathize with with those of you on that side of the ocean. Especially if you look at the lack of coordination from your ally in Washington. Whether it was about the travel ban on Europe, right? When a measure like that is taken without coordination, without even a heads up to your partner governments, it's again not a great sign in terms of how Washington is looking to deal with this crisis. It's not just America first, but it's also America first, and then 5-10 steps down the road, all right, we'll notify our allies, and we're seeing a consistent sort of barrage of news about the United States walking away from multilateral treaties and commitments. Every few weeks, it seems like there's something or the other that they're repealing from and walking away from, which I think puts Europe in a very difficult spot. Because I think you have to almost work around that. You have to sort of keep your alliance with the United States, but know that practically it doesn't really have much material sort of benefit. In fact, there poses some certain challenges that you have to try to overcome as you deal with and grapple with other actual consequences of this pandemic. And I'd also say that from this part, I'm certainly no expert. I think it will also be key, given everything we said about the importance of the EU and the European member states in general, to try to sort of manage the differences, whether it's between northern and southern countries in Europe. I think we've already seen some tensions growing from Italy, for example, along those lines, and hopefully that's something that can be managed in the period ahead. Peter, you've already talked about the sort of the economic measures that'll have to be taken to try to mitigate the recession as much as possible. I think that will be key, and hopefully will be something that continues to enable Europe to take a leadership role where others are failing to do so. And one thing I'll say, I also saw that there was a question in the chat on sanctions, which I can just briefly touch on. I think it was sort of referring to the impact of sanctions and how that's playing out in the pandemic. One additional call that the Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, both of them issued around the same time as the ceasefire call, was also to ease sanctions, basically sort of across the board, to allow for humanitarian assistance and to allow for agencies, humanitarian bodies, NGOs to provide aid and support where needed, so that the populations can at least have a bit more help to deal with this pandemic. That's also something that's sort of collided with geopolitics, because as we've seen at the Security Council and at the UN General Assembly, there have been concerns raised by Western members that Russia, for example, is trying to use that call to capitalize on it and play a little bit of mischief in calling for easing of sanctions measures for its own allies, even where that might not be warranted. And I think that's created a little bit of pushback, and it's unfortunately taken away from the real benefit and need for easing of sanctions measures, or at least allowing for quicker and easier exemptions to sanctions, so that humanitarian assistance can continue to pass through. So I think that's a good question to raise as well. And again, it speaks to trying to take away as many obstacles as possible, so that the populations that are suffering from this, can get as much help as they can. And last thing I'll say on that, and obviously something that we've been very concerned about, is how this pandemic will impact displaced populations, for example, and IDPs and refugees that are basically sort of crowded around small camps with limited or no access to proper healthcare facilities. And we're already seeing reports of outbreaks in Cox's Bazar, where Rohingya refugees are in Bangladesh, or in South Sudan in IDP camps, and that just fills one with a lot of fear about what we could see in the coming stage if that continues, if the numbers continue to rise, and if there's an absence of ways to try to control that. So that that's something that we've been flagging for a while, but as governments are fixated on their own pandemic inside their own borders, it's been another sort of blind spot, I think. And I think this again speaks to the need for not only the big humanitarian agencies, UNHCR and others, but also I think this is where maybe NGOs can play a helpful role on the ground. But maybe since they're closer to the ground, even though they aren't able to do the usual, maybe peace building activities or what have you, maybe they can play a role in terms of assistance. And the last thing I'll say is just again a word given the role of misinformation. I think in the coming stages, in the coming months, certainly we're already seeing this in the United States, where I think there was a recent poll where maybe 40% of the respondents, 30 or 40% of the respondents said that they wouldn't be open to taking a vaccine for COVID-19. And obviously there's a big anti-vaccination movement in the United States. So given the importance of a vaccine, whenever that, that is developed, even though it'll take a long time, I think it's important for governments, institutions, civil society organizations, and others to start to do work to try to build a consensus around the need for vaccinations. It'll be a public good. It'll be something that everyone will need to take on board. So I think that's something that's on our radar as well.
Thank you both. I really need to wrap up this discussion, but I'm asking you to do it, but do it briefly. I think we heard many lessons already. So very wise observations. I think it was Churchill who said, "Never waste a good crisis." And I think it was related even to the founding of the United Nations. We needed the Second World War to get united in the United Nations. This is a new, huge crisis. What should be the one lesson we shouldn't miss from this crisis? What is the lesson we should not waste? Ashish, would you like to go first? The one lesson we shouldn't miss.
Sure. For me, it's the absolute main lesson is that even if this pandemic has poses different challenges for different governments and hits different governments at different times. We're seeing, obviously we saw China first, then Italy, then the United States. It's like a slow building car crash, and each government deals with it in its own speed, in its own time. And one of the most immediate responses is to close borders. We need to deal with this ourselves. We need to mobilize our own resources, and we've seen this from the United States, where they've also sort of tried to keep an emphasis on resources for themselves. And there's reports of them trying to make sure that vaccinations that are developed are accessible to Americans first rather than the rest of the world, which is worrying because for me, again, the lesson is the collective response is really the only way. That something like this, even if it poses different challenges for different governments in different ways and at different times, the answer can really only be collectively, whether it's dealing with economic consequences of the recession and maybe the depression that's to follow, whether it's the development of a vaccine or development of medicine that can mitigate the symptoms and the lethality of this virus. I think collectiveness, the importance of multilateral institutions is only more important now, even though it might not seem that way than before this pandemic.
Thank you, Ashish. Peter, what is the one lesson we should not waste from this crisis?
Well, I was tempted to give you the simple answer, keep washing your hands, but more profoundly, Peter, as we approach now the phase of deconfinement, that is, that restrictions are going to be lifted gradually, that this will happen in a coordinated way, and in particular, because we all agree that the pandemic has been a great equalizer. But on the other hand, it is undisputable that some persons, some communities, some areas are affected more than others and are at risk of being left behind. People losing their jobs for good, missing out on innovation and technological advances in the coming period. So I think it is, from a social economic point of view, extremely important that governments see to it that everybody has the chance to come out of this crisis with equal opportunities. And internationally, this calls for what Ashish said, for a collective response. The United Nations would, of course, be ideally placed to provide coordination and guidance on this with the specialized organizations. But we need, again, it sounds trite, but we also need national leadership in this, which has been sorely lacking till so far. So I hope that deconfinement will lead to nobody being left behind, and that people will get additional assistance wherever that's necessary, so that their opportunities are opened in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter Veit, former diplomat. Thank you, Ashish Pradhan from the International Crisis Group. Thank you, Oxfam Novib, for organizing this with us. Thank you, all the participants and attendees, for your questions and your remarks and your comments. You're still going on. Very good. The next COVID Café is in exactly 1 week, also starting at 3 o'clock. But then we will discuss the impact of COVID on local humanitarian leadership. Please follow the website of KUNO. If you have any questions or suggestions of remark, use our website, send us an email, and we'll give follow-up to it.